Well, Chairman Larson and everyone gathered here tonight to celebrate the remarkable transparency that is a part of our dinner, part of our ethos. I'm tempted, given that beautiful introduction, to go into some personal history, which I hope will be interesting and not self-serving, but you might ask, why this preoccupation with transparency? And I would say, well, first of all, I was a Boy Scout. And that began at least a search that my parents encouraged. It led to a situation in which I was a columnist for my high school newspaper. I was on at least a regimen, as were I thought our athletes, of no smoke, no drink, no fooling around. But I found that some of our basketball team were, as a matter of fact, smoking and occasionally even drinking in those days. So as a columnist for the Shortreach Daily Echo, I wrote a column, and this was transparency to say the least, pointing out their indiscretions. Well, this was almost too much, not only for the journalism department of Shortreach High School, but for the poor principal. It turns out that the Thursday Daily Echo went to the school board each Thursday. And the principal knew the school board would be closely reading this situation about corruption at Shortreach, and simply pled with me, how in the world could you do this? And I really did have a heartfelt feeling for this wonderful man who had been almost like a father to me. But at the same time, it did clear up the problem. It was an unusual feat of high school journalism. And it led to my interest then in going into oratorical contests in the Methodist Church. That was even more of a stretch, admittedly, and I got really carried away with the gospel, which included, of course, telling the truth, transparency to say the least. And after one of these contests, my dad, a wonderful dad, was driving me back from DePaul University. And he just simply said calmly, he said, "Dick," he says, "I hope you really believed what you were saying." Well, that is very sobering. So by the time public life came along, and I had a chance to be mayor of Indianapolis, certainly a very long shot in a city whose demography did not really suggest a Republican was ever likely to be elected mayor of Indianapolis, I decided something that I ought to do right off the bat was to make sort of a public declaration of my finances. So as a result, I published a balance sheet of my assets and liabilities at that point, and I did so each year. And when I came to Congress, I did the same thing and put it in the congressional record each year. Now, I think the only people that ever paid attention to it were the press people in Indianapolis, who, feeling that this eccentricity at least surely would have some humor to it, would trace particular aspects of whether we had a good year at the farm or not, or whether my mortgage was being decreased properly, or other dilemmas of this variety. But it was at least a situation in which everybody knew what cards were on the table. Now, I mention all of this not in a self-serving way, but to say that just as each of you who have come here tonight, and the Floor Corporation very courageously, and Coca-Cola the year before, have taken steps in a world which, in a way, on occasion respects integrity and transparency, but on the other hand, wonders if this is not simply going too far. After all, we are all human beings. We all have our foibles and our difficulties, and I appreciate that, and I certainly have a full share of those. But I would simply say so much is at stake, as has already been expressed tonight, with regard to the future of hundreds of millions of people in the world who were counting upon persons such as ourselves who are in leadership positions, or positions at least in which we can try to influence leadership, to try to bring about a different situation in terms of telling the truth and of integrity. This is why in our work in the Foreign Relations Committee, my concentration and that of my fellow senators was always concentrated, first of all, upon the United States. The United States as the leader, as potentially the exemplar of this situation. We have huge problems of corruption at the local level, sometimes state government, hopefully not so often at the federal level, but nevertheless it's uncovered all of the time. We realize these difficulties, but still there really does have to be a shining symbol and one that needs to be polished a good bit more. And we concentrated next on the World Bank. Why on the World Bank? Because there really does need to be a focal point in which most of the countries of the world enter into the commerce, enter into the banking. Hopefully we'll enter into the reporting. There has to be leadership there. We focus thirdly on the extractive industries. Why? On oil and gas and valuable minerals, because these are all over our earth in different quantities, different types. But the disposition of the resources and buying and selling and trading in these situations makes a huge difference for the good or a disaster in terms of development of countries all over the world. We all sense that. These are not the only industries, but they exemplify a good part of the problem as well as the solution. And so as a result, a lot of our work in the Foreign Relations Committee centered around raising questions with the leadership of the World Bank or the interdevelopment banks or of others associated with them. Very frequently, these were embarrassing and difficult sessions, not only the public ones, a public testimony, but the private meetings in which the officers of these banks would come to us and ask, what in the world do you think you're doing here? Don't you understand this or that? And of course, we did try to understand, but we also understood the leadership role that they had to play, the problems that were clearly there. I remember vividly, again and again, as not only the World Bank, but even in our country, in USAID, or in elements of the State Department, resources went to the leaders of various countries. And very clearly, they misused them. We found a fourth source that we needed to look at, and that was the vitality of the press, of some public expression, of somebody prepared really to look into all of this. I'm very, very grateful that there were a number of senators who worked at this a long time. One is with us tonight, Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. Very, very strong advocate, leader and ally, as the case might be. Senator Pat Leahy of Vermont, who was my partner during our chairmanships in the Agriculture Committee, and all the examination of the extraordinary ways in which food maintains power. One can make a case, for example, even with the Arab Spring we have just been through, that the exciting thing was young people in Tahrir Square, say, in Egypt, asking for new rights, new transparency, new opportunities. But the facts of life were that back in the hustings, the bulk of Egyptians were held together by Hosni Mubarak or whoever the leaders were in the other countries, by so-called food subsidies or simply outright cash to try to provide at least some difference between death and sustenance. Certainly one cannot fault the leadership in trying to feed the people, but the manner in which this occurred, not an open system of markets, of development of agriculture, and development of the ways of distribution of food in any sort of equitable way, where the money is running out, the crises continue, and they become more intense, not only in the Middle East, but elsewhere in the world. And in large part, this is often in juxtaposition to the sale of oil or natural gas or other minerals, and a clearer misallocation in terms of humanity of those respects. I'm indebted, obviously, to Ben Cardin, a co-author of the Cardin-Lugar Amendment, and to the recent banking legislation, the Dodd-Frank bill. This work essentially was done by some very great staff people. On my staff, Neil Brown, who is not able to be with us tonight because he is traveling the world at this point, but Nilmani Rubin, who is here tonight, who worked on the World Bank problems and continued right on through with all of this, that did really a great job. I'm indebted to so many people in the Senate, both at the Senate level and staff, but likewise to very fine reporters and journalists who had uncovered all sorts of things, who made it possible for us really to bring about greater transparency and to boost the thought that one of the great outs of all of this will be a world in which there are people who have more knowledge, whether it's through the social media or through various other communication devices. The opportunities are abundant to pursue that realm in ways that perhaps we have not done before. I would just say that the Cardin-Lugar legislation was somewhat miraculous. I remember that debate as it proceeded, and very late in the game, we were recognized. We thought we would have a little debate on our amendment, but there wasn't really time for that. Perhaps it was the exhaustion of the process, but the amendment somehow got passed, and maybe it did not take at least much heat in the conference committee. But it was certainly observed by some of the oil companies in the United States. And I can remember vividly at least two conversations, I will call it this, as executives came to my office and really accused me of making their companies non-competitive in certain countries. They said, if all this information is released of the sales we have made, the terms we have made, who is getting paid and what have you, we're going to lose the business to oil companies in other countries. And they would often name countries that had hostile interests in the United States. And say, do you really want to put American industry in this kind of jeopardy while you're having your purest situation with regard to the Cardin-Lugar business? But we tried to at least calmly affirm that we felt we were on the right course. They challenged this all the way through as the administration tried to draw up rules for this. They're still challenging it in the courts, and it's really not clear how the court case or cases may finally come out. It is fairly clear that if we somehow last until the beginning of 2014, it does come into force, and that this will not solve the entire problem. It is one of many steps along the way in which industries play a huge role all over the world. Those in Transparency International play a great role in their advocacy and in getting out the word through the press and through even individual contact. But I believe that this is a time in which Transparency International and the whole evolution of this is not only on the rise, but as a matter of fact, the trend is clearly in our direction. The trend is with us at this point. And we ought to be confident of that. We ought to continue to pursue it. I'm really excited by the fact that we've come together tonight to celebrate the achievements of so many firms, so many persons, and likewise to enlist the aspirations of many who may not be so well acquainted with all of this, but really feel there is something here very important for the world and for human beings everywhere. I agree with you, and I'm very, very deeply honored to be a part of this dinner. I am very proud to accept the honors that have been accorded, and I will do my best in my new situation in what we call the Lugar Center we're going to attempt to bring together some of the brilliant staff members that we have had and other scholars to continue our work on what I call feeding the world, that is, trying to think through ways in which we will have much more productive agriculture, much greater integrity with regard to agricultural shipments and sales and science, and do a much better job in trying to breach at least the huge gap that is there in the world right now. I think you would understand I want to continue work on trying to control and destroy weapons of mass destruction all over this world. I think this is still a quest which is extremely important as other countries under the duress, even now as we see in the Far East, consider whether it might be a good idea for them to begin enriching uranium. And we have a very strong set of arguments on our hand why that would not be a good idea, but this is going to be out there. But I would just say, as another very important aspect of all of this, we will want to talk about Transparency International, about the whole idea of transparency, whether it's with arms control and developments of this sort, whether it's development of food resources and how this is to be done. Transparency has got to be basic, and it will be in our creations. We will do the best that we can, and I thank all of you for your encouragement. Thank you very much.